It was a quiet Thursday night when the storm hit. Elena Morales, a seasoned detective with over 2 decades of service, was sitting in her office, reviewing case files. The precinct was unusually silent, the kind of silence that made the air feel heavy. At 10:42 p.m., the door to her office burst open. 4 uniformed officers stormed in, their hands already on their cuffs, as if they had rehearsed the moment. One of them, Officer Greg Carter, stepped forward. His voice was loud, almost theatrical. "Elena Morales, you're under arrest for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority." There was no warrant, no explanation, just cold stares and a camera crew waiting outside, as if the arrest were a spectacle. Elena didn't argue, didn't scream, didn't even ask why. She simply stood, hands out, and let them cuff her. As they walked her through the precinct, her badge still on her hip and her gun in its holster, no one said a word. The front desk sergeant turned away, and a rookie she had once mentored barely made eye contact. Outside, the media swarmed like vultures. Cameras clicked, and reporters shouted questions. "Is it true you stole narcotics from the evidence room?" Elena kept her chin up, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She knew this wasn't about justice, it was a message, and she understood it loud and clear. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're from. Let's see how far this story has reached. In the back of the cruiser, Greg Carter slid in beside her, breaking protocol. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "You should have kept your nose out of things, Morales," he whispered. "Now look at you." Elena didn't flinch. "I was never scared of the dark," she replied quietly. "I just know it better than you do." At the station, she was fingerprinted, photographed, and locked in a holding cell for 6 hours. Her lawyer, Martin Cruz, wasn't allowed in until hour 4, a deliberate delay to give the press time to publish and the gossip time to spread. By the time Martin arrived, Elena was already headline material. "Your file's been sealed," Martin said, dropping into the metal chair across from her. "They're saying nothing's official yet, but the whole thing stinks. Internal Affairs isn't even handling this, it came straight from the top." Elena exhaled slowly. "You think it's Carter?" Martin nodded. "Him and a few others. It's a coordinated hit. I don't know what you stepped on, but they're covering something, and they're scared you'll dig it up." Elena leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had suspected something for a while, files gone missing, cases being redirected without explanation, evidence logs edited. But when she tried to question it, she was told she was being paranoid. Now, they had made it clear, asking questions was a risk, and being honest made her a target. 6 hours later, Elena was released with no formal charges, no explanation, and no apology. The file was marked, pending review, and the precinct watched her like she was already guilty. She didn't say a word as she walked out, but she made one call from the parking lot, not to her family or the press, but to the mayor. "It's time we had that conversation," she said into the phone. "And I want everything on the table." Then, Elena quietly disappeared from the public eye. She didn't return calls, didn't text back, didn't post anything. It was as if she had vanished. For the precinct, that was good news. For a week, officers carried on like nothing had happened. Greg Carter was seen in the break room making jokes. "Maybe she finally realized she wasn't one of us," he grinned, chewing on a powdered donut. But while they relaxed, rumors swirled outside the station walls. A bartender claimed he'd overheard city clerks talking about a quiet meeting at City Hall. Another rumor said Elena had been spotted walking into the Department of Justice building in Salem. Elena had taken up a short-term rental in a nearby town under a different name. She wasn't hiding, she was planning. A local tech firm owed her a favor, and they helped her build a database of internal affairs records. What she found wasn't just negligence, it was a pattern. Certain names kept appearing across reports: Greg Carter, Officer Kyle Redmond, Sergeant Tom Avery, and even Captain Dwight Penley. Excessive force, missing evidence, witness coercion, all filed under different case numbers and shuffled through layers of bureaucracy. Dozens of victims, some cases closed within hours of being filed, others simply vanished. Elena printed every name, every date, every complaint, and circled the ones that overlapped. It wasn't about getting her badge back anymore. It was about taking down a system that protected predators in uniform. She spent her days cross-referencing incidents, building a timeline, and connecting the dots. The more she dug, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a network, a system designed to protect itself at all costs. Elena knew she couldn't do this alone. She reached out to a few trusted contacts, people who had been pushed aside or silenced for asking too many questions. Slowly, quietly, she began to assemble a team. But she also knew the risks. The people she was up against had already shown they were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their secrets. Elena had to be careful, methodical, and above all, patient. She wasn't just fighting for her career anymore. She was fighting for justice, for the victims whose voices had been silenced, for the officers who still believed in doing the right thing, and for the integrity of the badge she had worn for over 2 decades. The plan was set. Now, it was time to execute it. 3 days after her disappearance, Elena Morales was quietly reinstated, not as a detective, but as the new Internal Affairs Commander with a temporary federal mandate. The decision came from the mayor's office and the Department of Justice, bypassing the usual channels. There was no press release, no fanfare, just a signed document and a new badge. Meanwhile, Greg Carter and his crew were celebrating what they thought was a victory. The charges against Elena had been dismissed, and they assumed the city had backed down. They planned a Friday night gathering at a local bar, calling it a send-off to the witch hunt. Captain Dwight Penley even showed up, ordering pitchers of beer like it was a promotion party. But while they laughed and drank, Elena was already at work. She arrived at the precinct early, parking in the side lot and entering through the back door. The building buzzed with tension as officers whispered in corners, their phones buzzing with updates. Elena posted a list on the notice board, mandatory internal interviews. The first name on the list was Kyle Redmond. When Redmond entered her office, Elena shut the door quietly and offered him a seat. "Let's talk about March 12, 3 years ago," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Your body cam was active for 7 minutes at the Langford scene. Where's the footage?" Redmond stammered. "I don't know. It should have uploaded. Maybe it was a glitch." Elena leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "You've got one chance to tell the truth. If I find out you were part of any cover-up, that badge won't protect you. Not anymore." Redmond's eyes darted around the room. Finally, he cracked. "He was alive when I got there. Langford. He was breathing. I called it in, but Carter told me not to put it in the log. Said it would complicate things." Elena didn't react. She simply made a note. "Are you willing to give that statement under oath?" Redmond swallowed hard. Yes. The pressure was working. At his home, Greg Carter was unraveling. He wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. He started calling old friends, trying to secure favors, asking about loopholes and immunity. But it was too late. The cracks were showing inside the precinct too. A young patrol officer, Darnell Coates, dropped off a USB drive in Elena's inbox with no note. When she opened it, it contained audio from 2 years ago, Carter threatening a witness off the record. By Friday morning, the arrest warrants came. Carter was pulled from his car in front of a sandwich shop, still chewing on a bite of pastrami. Avery didn't even get a warning, his front door was kicked in before sunrise. The news hit the evening reports like wildfire. "Internal corruption scandal rocks Eugene's 9th district," the headlines read. Pundits lined up to dissect the story, but for Elena, none of it was about headlines. She stood in the hallway that Friday afternoon, watching the same precinct she was dragged out of, now surrounded by state vehicles. Officers were escorted in cuffs past the lockers where they'd once stored their lies. Elena didn't smile, didn't gloat. She walked down the hall slowly and paused by the door to the squad room. The chatter inside went dead silent. "Some of you were part of this," she said, scanning the room. "Some of you weren't. But everyone here let it happen. Silence let it spread. Ignoring it made it stronger." She let the words hang. "From now on, if you lie, you're out. If you cover for someone, you're gone. If you abuse the badge, you won't walk out of here with it again. That's the new standard. Not a threat, a promise." The fallout was swift and brutal. Captain Penley agreed to step down and cooperate in exchange for leniency. His statement implicated several others, including officers who had been part of the cover-up network. The Department of Justice launched a full-scale audit of the precinct, and the mayor publicly condemned the corruption. Elena's office became a hub of activity. She and Detective Nina Reyes worked late into the night, reviewing complaints from other precincts and building cases against those who had abused their power. The work was exhausting, but it was also cathartic. For the first time in years, Elena felt like she was making a real difference. But the fight wasn't over. The system she was up against was deeply entrenched, and there were still those who would do anything to protect it. Elena knew she had to stay vigilant. One evening, as she drove home, she noticed a smashed taillight on her car. There was no note, no cameras in the back lot, just silence. She didn't report it. Instead, she replaced the bulb herself and drove to work early the next morning. The message was clear: they were still watching. But Elena wasn't backing down. She pinned a photo of Langford on her bulletin board, underneath it a note that simply read, "Ask the questions anyway." The work was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Elena felt hope. Justice wasn't just a concept, it was something she could fight for, something she could demand. And she wasn't going to stop until she got it. Elena Morales had one final stop to make. She waited until the end of the day, no reporters, no entourage, just her and a folder under her arm. She walked the quiet hallway of the county jail, past the vending machines and flickering fluorescent lights, until she reached the holding area. "Here to see Greg Carter," she told the deputy on duty. Carter sat behind the thick glass, hands cuffed in front of him. He looked older, paler, his jaw bruised from the takedown. His uniform was gone, replaced by orange scrubs and a plastic wristband. "Didn't think you'd come," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual smugness. "I didn't come for you," Elena replied, her tone steady. "I came for the truth." Carter scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Truth? You think any of this makes you the hero?" "No," she said flatly. "I think it makes you the warning." There was a long silence between them. Carter shifted uncomfortably, the metal cuffs clinking as he moved. "You could have kept your head down," he muttered. "You had the respect, the record. You would have made captain. And let people like you keep poisoning the badge?" Elena asked, her voice sharp. "No thanks." Carter looked away, his bravado crumbling. "You think I started this? You think I was the only one?" "No," Elena said. "But you were the one who enjoyed it the most." She stood, the folder still in her hand. She tapped it once against the glass. "This is every statement, every file, every name tied to what you did. I'm not holding it for revenge. I'm holding it to remind myself why I keep showing up. Because for every officer like you, there's a kid out there who still believes cops are supposed to protect them." Carter said nothing. He stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally settling on him. Elena turned and walked out, never looking back. Outside the jail, the late afternoon light cut across the pavement. It was quiet, Not the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, but the kind that meant something was finally over. Elena took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion, but also a quiet determination. Back at her office, Detective Nina Reyes was waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a stack of new files. "You ready for round 2?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. Elena took a breath, glancing at the pile of paperwork. "Not yet," she said. "But I will be." They sat side by side, reviewing complaints from other precincts, new names, new stories. The work never stopped, but now it had meaning again. Elena pinned a photo of Langford on her bulletin board, underneath it a note that simply read, "Ask the questions anyway." Later that evening, Elena drove out past the city limits, just her and the road. She thought about the victims, those whose cases were buried, whose voices were ignored. She thought about her younger self, stepping into her first uniform, proud and ready, not knowing how heavy the silence could be. And she thought about what it meant to carry that weight with both hands and never let it break you. Because integrity isn't loud. It doesn't always win awards. It doesn't show up on the news. Sometimes, it walks into a building full of enemies and still does the job. Elena didn't come back for revenge. She came back to remind them, and herself, that justice only works if someone's brave enough to demand it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena turned her car around and headed back to the city. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right side of it. And that was enough. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, it means a lot to us.